These are instructions and content on how to write a 5-paragraph argumentative thesis essay answering the inquiry question, how successful was Reconstruction in granting African Americans equal rights? First, we will read and break down the inquiry question by annotating your thoughts about important ideas, historical context, your own questions and knowledge about the topic, or paraphrasing. Contextualization can be done through practicing chunk and summarize, in which you organize and express the meaning of the information in your own words. This paragraph gives us the context around which we can understand Reconstruction. It begins, in 1865, after the Union had won the Civil War against the Confederacy, the country began the work of reuniting politically, socially, and economically. This period became known as Reconstruction, which lasted from 1865 to 1877. The South was destroyed and needed to be rebuilt. The South's economy would need to change. During the war, the Emancipation Proclamation had freed enslaved peoples in Confederate states, and the 13th Amendment ended slavery in the entire country. Millions of formerly enslaved people were now free and were promised rights and opportunities that had been denied to them under slavery. But for many, there was still a great deal of anger and challenging questions. Should the former Confederacy be forgiven or punished? How should African Americans be supported in coming out of the system of slavery? How could hundreds of years of racist ideology be reversed? While there were examples of progress, like the work of the Freedmen's Bureau, new civic opportunities, like access to voting and political office, and the end of slavery, there was also a backlash, like the rise of the KKK, voting restrictions, and the Black Codes, as well as new systems of economic control known as sharecropping. This brings us to the inquiry question. How successful was Reconstruction in securing African Americans equal rights? You might begin by using a starter example to answer this question for yourself about your own goals during this inquiry. The starter is, by learning more about blank, I will be better able to answer the larger inquiry question because. If you select this, you'll be setting a specific goal and giving yourself the benefit that you seek when answering this question. This is advisable and recommended because it will focus your learning for yourself beyond just this assignment. You might also select the option to write what you hope to learn to help you answer the question, or to put the question into your own words, or to write your hypothesis of your answer at this stage. Each one of these options allows you to explore the inquiry question at this stage of your understanding, giving you a better frame and focus as you work through the evidence that will come in the later parts of this presentation. Part 2 will be to examine a timeline, and you should annotate this timeline by putting next to one event that surprises you, a star, and a question mark next to one event that you are curious about. Engage with the timeline, and you will engage your memory to create better retention of the information for you to use later on. The Reconstruction timeline is as follows. In 1865, the Civil War ended. Republican President Abraham Lincoln was assassinated, and the Democrat Andrew Johnson, who was Lincoln's vice president, becomes the President of the United States. The 13th Amendment to the Constitution was passed and ended slavery. Congress created the Freedmen's Bureau to help the freed men and women, formerly slaves, to transition from slavery. In 1866, the Civil Rights Act of 1866 was passed, which allowed African Americans to own property and to be treated equally in court. But in 1866, the Ku Klux Klan was also founded. And in 1867, radical Republicans took over Congress. In 1868, the 14th Amendment to the Constitution was passed and guaranteed all people equal protection under the law. Also in 1868, the first African American was elected to the United States Congress. In 1869, Ulysses S. Grant was elected president. In 1870, the 15th Amendment to the Constitution was passed and guarantees the right to vote that cannot be denied based upon race. In 1871, Congress passed the Ku Klux Klan Act of 1871 in response to reports of widespread violence in the South. It's important to note that this act was rarely enforced. In 1872, the Freedmen's Bureau was ended. In 1874, Democrats took control of the United States Congress. Radical Republicans were no longer in power in Congress. In 1877, Rutherford B. Hayes was elected president and officially ended Reconstruction in a political deal that ended Reconstruction in exchange for securing his presidency after an unclear election result. Rutherford B. Hayes pulls out all remaining troops from the southern states. At this point, you might try a challenge question. The challenge question so far would be, at what point in the timeline does there seem to be a shift from progress to setbacks? Explain your thinking. We'll now offer additional information for you to record in the note-taking section of your handout for the lecture notes on Reconstruction. Use that handout and pause this video frequently to record your thoughts in the spaces provided. Reconstruction. Was Reconstruction a success or a failure? In many ways, you can answer this question, yes, it was a failure, and yes, it was a success. Reconstruction is known as the time period immediately after the Civil War, from 1865 until 1877. Reconstruction begins at the end of the Civil War, and the southern states lay in ruin, having been burned and destroyed over the scope and sequence of the Civil War. The 13th Amendment was passed at the end of the Civil War, which abolished slavery. From 1865 to 1877, Reconstruction attempted to reunite the country and to rebuild the South. Politically, economically, and socially, the North and the South remained separate nations who did not agree upon the future of the country. Politically, they were divided between Republicans in the North and Democrats in the South. Economically, the North was a manufacturing economy and the South was an agricultural economy. Socially, the North saw itself as more urban and more tolerant of immigrants and different races and religions, whereas the South saw it socially different and special culture as closed to immigration and to diversity. Reconstruction was also a time of great opportunity, as the federal government was spending vast amounts of money to help rebuild the South by building railroads, rebuilding cities, and offering money to anyone who would go into the South to attempt to help. It was also a time of great resistance to change, where the Southerners rejected many of the elements that were necessary to heal the wounds of the nation after the Civil War. Republicans, mostly from the North, wanted Reconstruction. They wanted Reconstruction to offer full rights and equality for freed men, a term used for former slaves. This viewpoint was known as radical because it was outside of the normal thinking of white Americans at the time. Republicans who wanted full rights and equality for former slaves were known as radical Republicans. Democrats, mostly from the South, were angry at the changes that took place during Reconstruction. Angry that the former slaves were now free, angry that the former slaves had rights, angry that the war was over and the South had lost, angry that they suffered a humiliating and devastating defeat. Radical Reconstruction, which is part of the entire Reconstruction period, lasted from 1867 to 1874. It's defined in these years because it's when radical Republicans controlled Congress and implemented many of the major changes, including amendments to the Constitution. The changes to the Constitution include 13 amendments. 3 amendments, the 13th Amendment, the 14th Amendment, and the 15th Amendment. The 13th Amendment ended slavery. The 14th Amendment guarantees equal protection under the law. The 15th Amendment guarantees that the right to vote cannot be denied based on race. These have had long-lasting impacts upon our nation and were used effectively by the modern civil rights era in the 1950s and 1960s to challenge continued racism and violence towards African Americans in the courts and in the law. During Reconstruction, the Freedmen's Bureau was established by the radical Republicans in Congress. The Freedmen's Bureau was tasked with supporting the freed slaves, the freed former slaves, who had no property, no money, and now no place to live. The Freedmen's Bureau opened schools to educate former slaves and supported freedmen with food, clothing, and medicine, but often encouraged the former slaves to work for the very same plantation owners whom once called them master. During Reconstruction, African Americans had many new opportunities that they had never enjoyed before. Being able to vote meant that African Americans could be elected to political office, and many served in state legislatures throughout the South during Reconstruction, only to be thrown out of office when white Southerners regained control of politics after Reconstruction. Furthermore, many African Americans started their own churches, which became cultural and social centers to help African American communities to survive for decades to come. The Black Codes and Jim Crow laws are examples of resistance to the changes during Reconstruction. These were laws that were passed by Southern states and towns to maintain white supremacy and the segregation of races after the Civil War. In order to maintain white supremacy in the law and in the ballot box, voting restrictions were put into place that did not specifically take away the rights of African Americans based upon the color of their skin, but were intended to have that very same effect. Poll taxes, literacy tests, and grandfather clauses denied African Americans the right to vote without saying specifically it was because of the color of their skin. It was an economic restriction, an educational restriction, or something that would benefit whites simply because someone in their family had voted prior to the Civil War. Legally, none of these could be challenged under the 14th or 15th Amendments to the Constitution because they did not specifically say it was because of race, but the intention and the effect were the same. Economically, African Americans after the Civil War suffered a form of economic slavery known as sharecropping, in which African American farmers would rent land very frequently from their former slave masters and would remain constantly in debt, unable to leave the land, and if they tried, they could be arrested and returned to a form of slavery legal under the 13th Amendment. This form of economic slavery maintained the white supremacy and the slave-based economy of the South for another 60 years after the Civil War. To maintain control over African Americans and to maintain white supremacy throughout the South, violence and fear in the form of terrorism ran rampant through hate organizations like the Ku Klux Klan and others. They openly targeted African Americans for violence, lynching over 5,000 African Americans from 1870 till 1950. The end of Reconstruction came at the end of the presidency of Ulysses S. Grant, when the election of 1876 saw no clear winner in the presidential election. Some states had a disputed outcome, and the election was ultimately decided in favor of the Republican Rutherford B. Hayes, who, by promising to remove troops from the South, was able to gain a victory in the Electoral College, and therefore ended Reconstruction in a bargain that gave him political power. Having heard the information in the previous lecture, you should take time to fill out the structured academic controversy in your handout for this exercise. It's entitled, "How Successful Was Reconstruction at Securing African Americans Equal Rights?" You're given a number of different spots in which you can write a claim with reference to a document that is included in your handout, evidence and commentary to help you to better note and understand what the evidence is saying. I'll now take some time to go through the written responses for you to answer using 1 to 2 sentences each. Using the lecture notes that you took, you should try to answer each of these with 1 to 2 sentences each. Number 1 asks you to summarize. What was Reconstruction and why was it such a challenging time in the country's history? Try to connect this to the causes of the Civil War and how the war was fought and or how Reconstruction actually happened. Next, you should answer number 2. Reconstruction had short-term and long-term consequences. When considering long-term consequences, one positive could be the passing of the 14th and 15th Amendments, which were used in the 1960s as a huge part of the civil rights movement, which was led by Martin Luther King Jr. Some long-term negatives could be the new form of racial segregation, known as Jim Crow, the criminalization of African Americans using black codes, and the economic consequences of sharecropping that held many African Americans in poverty for generations. Answer this question in 1 to 2 sentences. In your opinion, what matters more in answering the inquiry question? The short-term consequences or the long-term consequences? And why? Question number 3. Answer the inquiry question. How successful was Reconstruction at securing African Americans equal rights? Try to give 1 to 2 points to support each side, and then give your overall view. One suggestion is to go back to the beginning of this exercise and to see your initial response to the inquiry question and to think about how it may have changed since you listened to the lecture information on the previous slides. We'll now take a deeper dive into primary sources where you can gather evidence to support your answer to the inquiry question. As we go through, annotate and note frequently in each document to help you better understand and summarize its meaning. Pause this presentation frequently to give yourself time to make those notes and annotations. Document A is the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments to the Constitution. Article 13, Section 1 reads, "Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction." Article 13, or also known as the 13th Amendment, ended slavery in the United States. But please note the passage says, "except as a punishment for a crime where the party shall be duly convicted." This is a loophole in the 13th Amendment that allows for someone to be made a slave if they have been convicted in a court of law. The Black Codes could convict African Americans of any crime that whites considered to be illegal, from homelessness to talking back. And by violating the law, African Americans could be returned to slavery under the Constitution. Article 14, also known as Amendment 14, reads as follows: "All persons born and or authorized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States. Nor shall any state deprive any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, nor deny any person within its jurisdiction the equal protections of the law." The 14th Amendment here establishes equal protection under the law, not just for American citizens, but for all people inside the country. It's very important to underline and circle the word citizen when you see it, as well as the word person whenever you see it. The writers of the 14th Amendment intentionally made a distinction between persons and citizens so that citizenship would be established, and yet there would not be two types of law for non-citizens. Immigrants to the United States enjoy all the protections under the Constitution as a result of the writing of Article 14 that establishes all persons, and not just citizens, shall have the due process of law under the courts and the Constitution. Article 15, also known as Amendment 15, reads as follows: "The right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude." This establishes the right to vote for freedmen in the United States, and in an ongoing tradition that forbids the government, state or federal, from interfering with someone's right to vote because of the color of their skin. Document B is from the Black Codes that were created after the Civil War. The source here comes from Louisiana, Opelousas, Louisiana, July 3, 1865. In the years following the Civil War, many southern states and cities passed Black Codes. These laws laid out what freed blacks were and were not allowed to do. The document below, passed July 3, 1865, is a black code from Opelousas, Louisiana. All freedmen, freed Negroes and mulattoes over the age of 18 years found on the second Monday in January 1866 or thereafter with no lawful employment or business shall be deemed homeless, and on conviction thereof shall be fined $50 and imprisoned at the discretion of the court. No Negro or freedman shall be allowed to come within the limits of the town of Opelousas without special permission from his employers. Whoever breaks this law will go to jail and work for 2 days on public streets or pay a fine of $5. No Negro or freedman shall be permitted to rent or keep a house in town under any circumstances. No Negro or freedman shall live within the town who does not work for some white person or former owner. No public meetings of Negroes or freedmen shall be allowed within the town. No freedman shall be allowed to carry firearms or any kind of weapons. No freedman shall sell or exchange any article of merchandise within the limits of Opelousas without permission in writing from his employer. Every Negro is to be in the service of or work for some white person or former owner. This document uses the word Negro frequently, and it is important to point out that Negro is not an appropriate word anymore for use in common conversation. It is used here not as any other reference except in history. This document describes how the law was used to enforce slavery after the 13th Amendment banned the practice, because the result of these laws was that any violation by African Americans could be used to return them to servitude. And therefore, the use of the law becomes part of the systemic racism that was used to maintain white supremacy for years and decades after the Civil War. Document C is a speech by Frederick Douglass, a famous former slave and abolitionist leader, in September of 1883. It reads, "Though the colored man is no longer subject to be bought and sold, he is still surrounded by negativity and opposition, which accompanies him in all his movements. His course upward is resented and resisted at every step of his progress. The color line meets him everywhere, and in measure shuts him out of all respectable and profitable trades and callings. If liberty, with us, is yet but a name, our citizenship is but a sham, and our suffrage thus far only a cruel mockery. We may still congratulate ourselves upon the fact that the laws and institutions of the country are sound, just, and liberal. There is hope for a people when their laws are righteous, whether for the moment they conform to their requirements or not. But until this nation shall make its reality fall in line with its constitution and its righteous laws, it will not improve the condition of the colored people of this country." In this document, we see how Frederick Douglass describes how the law may read one way and reality entirely differently, and that the laws of the United States ended slavery, but the condition of African Americans was one of constant fear and violence, where whites used the law as a way to almost make fun of the former slaves, and that the reality was far from what the law required. Document D is a political cartoon that appeared in Harper's Weekly, a magazine, in 1876, showing voting restrictions in the South. Even though freedmen were granted the right to vote with the 15th Amendment, Southern whites found ways to prevent African Americans from voting using poll taxes, grandfather clause, and intimidation and violence. Without freedmen's votes, the traditional party of the South, the Democratic Party, was able to regain control of Southern politics. Please note in the cartoon the gun in each of the white men's hands and how it is pointed at the head of the former slave. The caption of the cartoon reads, "Of course he wants to vote the Democratic ticket. This, of course, is sarcastic because African Americans would not have supported a political party that would have not benefited African Americans, like the Democratic Party in 1876. But because of the threat of violence, the African American voter wants to vote the Democratic ticket to avoid being harmed by the white men. Note that the Democrats in the South are often the ones against Reconstruction's efforts to help African Americans. Document E has two parts, the first part being a map showing freedmen's schools that were started by the Freedmen's Bureau. Each of the red spots on this map shows the formation of a black college established during the Reconstruction era. Many of these were very important institutions that helped to educate a future leadership class of African Americans. This would be essential to later efforts for civil rights, including the modern civil rights movement led by the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Document E has a second part, which is a picture showing education of African Americans. The caption reads, "Before the Civil War, it was considered a crime for a slave to learn how to read and write. So it is not surprising that schools were considered to be a priority to many people after emancipation." The illustration above shows a school for freedmen in Mississippi, and the map shows the number of traditional African American schools that were started in the South after the Civil War. Document F is entitled Worse Than Slavery. It comes from Harper's Weekly, a magazine, published in October of 1874. It's a political cartoon depicting conditions faced by African Americans in the South at the time. The caption here reads, "In 1865, the KKK was originally founded as a social club for former Confederate soldiers, but it soon evolved into a terrorist organization. It would be responsible for thousands of deaths and would work to weaken the political power of Southern blacks and Republicans. The Klan would use strategies like mob violence, the burning of homes, schools, and churches, and beating and killing African Americans and any people who supported them, as well as lynching and other terrorist tactics meant to cause fear and to intimidate African Americans." Document G shows photographs of elected black officials who served during Reconstruction. These photographs are from the 1870s. The caption reads, "During Reconstruction, thousands of African Americans were elected to local and state governments throughout the southern states. In addition, 17 African Americans were elected to the United States Congress from southern states between 1870 and 1877. Here are photographs of 6 of these 17 elected officials." This document might be used as evidence to suggest that African Americans received equal rights and protections during Reconstruction, as these African Americans are well dressed and serving in positions of political power, which would have been impossible before Reconstruction. Document H is a sharecropping graphic showing how sharecropping worked as an economic system to maintain white supremacy and the enslavement of African Americans. The caption reads, "In the South during Reconstruction, a system of economic slavery known as sharecropping emerged, where formerly enslaved people would rent land, but high interest rates would often make it impossible to pay off debts, meaning the sharecropper would be forced to continue to work there to pay off debts. Often the debts got bigger and bigger, leading to a cycle of poverty shown in the graphic below." Now that we've covered the information necessary to answer the inquiry question, I'd like to take some time to explain how you might outline your essay for this exercise. The essay outline is on the screen in front of us here. It begins with an introductory paragraph of about 4 to 5 sentences. You should use these 4 to 5 sentences to do 2 things: develop context and to create a 1-sentence thesis. To develop context, you should use any historical background information provided in the question and outside knowledge, and to write about the who, the what, the where, and the when of the question. Do that using about 3 or 4 sentences. Since we're writing about Reconstruction, there's a lot of information you could give about the situation facing African Americans, as well as the country after the Civil War. Your thesis sentence is a very important part of your essay, and you should take extra time to make sure that you write it clearly. Your thesis sentence should appear in the last sentence of your introductory paragraph. It's important to put it there so that your reader knows what you're about to prove. It should be 1 sentence with 3 supporting reasons that directly answers the question. There are multiple parts of the thesis referred to as supporting reasons or claims, and each of these 3 reasons will be covered in an individual paragraph called a claim paragraph. And the analytic thesis will make clear connections between these claims. If our inquiry question is about how African Americans' rights were secured through Reconstruction, you should answer it in yes or no, with 3 reasons explaining why yes or why no. Take a minute to practice writing your thesis now, based upon the information that you've already recorded. This is an important part of your essay because it sets up the next 3 paragraphs, making your answer clear and easy to follow for your reader. If your reader can't understand your thesis, then you will lose the attention and you will be unable to convince your reader that you're correct. So take time to make sure your thesis has 3 clear reasons answering the prompt. Once you have answered your thesis statement, you can move on to your first claim paragraph. This paragraph should be about 5 to 7 sentences in length. The topic sentence for your claim paragraph 1 should be the first claim from your thesis. Remember, you have 3 claims in your thesis. This is the first of those 3 claims. Your topic sentence should essentially restate your answer to the inquiry question, but only in terms of the first reason. Then you will quote your evidence in your second sentence. You quote your evidence citing your source. You set up your evidence by blending it into your paragraph, by introducing the speaker, then the source, then the subject, and then finally adding your quotation. An example of this would be Thomas Jefferson wrote in the Declaration of Independence about liberty, quote. Thomas Jefferson would be the speaker, the source would be the Declaration of Independence, and the subject would be liberty, and then finally the quote. After you quote from your primary source, you should offer analysis through the explanation of that quote. What does this quote mean in your own words? And then after that, an additional sentence that explains how this quotation helps to answer the inquiry question. Your final sentence of your first claim paragraph should be a transition sentence to your next paragraph, or your next claim, claim number 2. This sentence should connect the current claim to the next claim, offering a way for the reader to see that you are in the process of answering all aspects of your thesis. Your claim paragraph number 2 should also be about 5 to 7 sentences long. Again, it should start with a topic sentence that restates the claim, mentioning the specific second supporting reason from your thesis. Again, you should quote from an author or source, setting up your quote and blending it into your paragraph. Like your first paragraph, you should analyze the quote with an explanation of what it means, and how it helps to answer the question. And then transition to your third claim paragraph by making a connection between Claim 2 and Claim 3. Next, you'll do the same in claim paragraph number 3, which will be the same amount of sentences, 5 to 7, in which you will repeat the process that you've done in the first claim paragraph and the second claim paragraph. Lastly, you should write a conclusion, a paragraph of about 4 to 5 sentences, in which you restate or summarize your thesis, but not exactly in the same words as you've used before. This is important so that your reader feels like they're reading and not just being lectured to with the same catchphrases and talking points. Restating or rephrasing helps to keep your writing fresh and your reader entertained. You should also restate or summarize your evidence that you've gone over in your previous 3 paragraphs, but only briefly and not repeating the analysis in detail. And then lastly, you should end your essay and your conclusion with an explanation of the lasting or long-term importance of your answer to this question. And remember, our question is about Reconstruction and how it secured the rights of African Americans, an issue that continues to be debated and controversial in American society even now. Referencing any current crisis or controversy surrounding civil rights for African Americans and people of color would be one way to conclude your essay, explaining the long-term importance of your answer. This has been comments and context for the 5-paragraph argumentative thesis essay task, answering the inquiry question, was Reconstruction a success or a failure? Thank you very much.